Welcome back to Her Many Voices, where we don't whisper the truth. We breathe it, plant it, and sometimes dig our nails into it. This is Gaia Gossip, and today we're getting dirty. Not like scandal dirty, but like earth dirty. The kind of dirt that comes from touching the land, remembering our the colonial systems tried and failed to erase us, and how reclaiming indigenous matriarchy is helping to change that trajectory of image and self identity for our people. Today, I'm super honored to sit with Dr. Renee Holt, an Indigenous matriarch, scholar, and land based knowledge keeper who cares around Indigenous education and the places that we live and our lived experience. So, today, we're going to be talking about education serves as medicine and knowledge transfers help us withstand these systems that can be abusive. And so, Dr. Holt, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here with us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate this. This is a great time. I yeah, just look forward to having conversation with you and yeah, just extend uh the same welcome back to all.
Yes, it's great to be doing this show specifically with one of my Indigenous sisters and fellow matriarchs here on our ancestral homelands of the Nimipu, and to just kind of come full circle with the work that we have both done, healing not just ourselves, but, the community work that we do within education. And so I mentioned earlier land based education or place based education. I think a lot of people hear of that and they just mostly think of like outdoor learning with maybe like a little cultural twist or like, maybe a drum circle or something that, but that's not what we're going to be talking about today. So let's get a little bit more grounded in this conversation by having you share just a little bit more about what land based education means to you.
Um, thank you. Um, well, first, I guess I just want to share, a little bit of who I am, how I was taught to introduce myself as a young girl. And personally, that's actually what helps ground me in in thinking about land or place-based education because there are so many teachers, over the years that have shared little things in that collective knowledge, collective cultural knowledge. There's always this one universal understanding about our how we identify ourselves. And for me, I'm Dene, and then I'm also Nimipu. In Dene, we introduce ourselves with our clans, and so how I was taught, is how what I'll share with you all, and then in Nimipu to share my Indian name and how I was also taught, and both introductions and both understandings of who I am as an indigenous woman always comes down to the lands of my ancestors or our ancestors. And collectively speaking, from wherever you are hearing this, if you are an indigenous person, you'll understand and know. So first off, She'e Renee Shia Tsenaha Bikni Shle is a thana a bushes chin do dashanessa. Auto Tsinigine dasha che do bi petoni e dashanala kut out e dona asanshle. And I just shared my um, my clans and my mother, who I get my infinite clan line through, is we come from the with the rock clan, Tsenapithni. And then I was born raised by the Mini Goats clan, and my maternal grandparents are Black Streakwood, and my paternal grandparents are the Deer and Springwater. And then biologically, my father, late father, he was Nez Perce. And my Indian name, as I was given and gifted, and I was a young girl, young lady, is like in Yat, in Imunique was like in Yat, in Mamayats. Asamo ka tawas ilbip ka itiaya kutkalamet. And as a mother, I realize that the responsibility of parenthood extends beyond my children. And so whenever I introduce myself in either Nez Perce or in Navajo, it's always an acknowledgement of being a mother. And so I share that. And for me, um, and I've had different teachers over the years, mostly elders who have passed and are no longer here. So their ancestral knowledge about where we come from. When I received my Indian name, I was told, your name comes from these lands, and this is where you belong. You are a part of the land here. And I've heard that from different people, not just one of my elders, but others who've shared what that means and what that responsibility entails is a long line of knowledge that has been passed down. And so land-based or place-based is really it's a connection to Mother Earth. In Dene, we say Nihimabama, Nihimabaka, and Nihima just means our mother, and then Baka is the surface. Um, and so, that's a loose translation, but there's really no English translation for certain um, words in indigenous languages. you know, we tend to sometimes want to understand what does that mean, but we appropriate it from a Western space. Like we want a literal translation of something, and that's not always possible. And so land-based knowledge, land-based education comes from a specific place, and it's held by, certain people, cultural knowledge keepers, and passed down generationally to the next generation or the younger. And that can vary. Younger can be someone who's in their 50s, and then younger can also mean someone who's in their, adolescence. And so there's different ways to look at it, but I always view and see place-based, not like a technical Western terminology. When I see it, I kind of look at it and think, they mean land. Because as a Native person, everything's related to the land. Who we are is about the land. Um, our creation stories come from the land. Our songs come from the land. Our teachings come from the land. How we live in relationship with the land is all linked back to this common understanding that we are of the land. And I don't think that word placed base is really as connected as land based is. And so I prefer to use land based. I have colleagues who use place based, and it's no knock to them. I just have a preference because I feel like land is who I am. And Indigenous people, we have a relationship with the land that goes back thousands of generations. Um, I've got a I've got a cousin who has a friend, you know, they were talking recently, and the lady shared, I can go back 25 generations of my ancestry. I can name people that far back. And that was a real conversation starter for them. And I think we can all go back that far if we start telling our stories and keeping our children, in mind when we tell these stories. But it always comes back to the land. How long have you and your people been here? When did you move here? What part of the area do you live? It's just all related to the land. So, yeah, that's kind
Yes.
of how I see that.
So as you are saying that, and it just makes me think of, the land actually as a teacher, that concept is threatening to certain systems. Um, 25 generations, being able to reclaim that through like a genetic imprint of identity has been so fractured. And in my family, I'm just thinking of my own, my own granny, uh, who was a survivor of that boarding school era, and what lost, in just 2 or 3 generations of recall, based on the teacher, the land as a teacher. And so, yeah, I see that the actual concept of the land as an educator is very threatening to just the colonial education system in general, and disrupting matriarchy is a big way to weaponize our knowledge transfer from mother to mother, daughter to daughter, or mother to daughter, excuse me. And so, I guess, not completely shifting gears from that conversation, but I mean, let's be real. Education has been the most effective weapon of the colonial intrusion to disrupt that knowledge transfer. So, from your perspective, I guess, how does that relationship to the land and identity and self worth, like how do you see formal Western education being a part of that toolkit?
Mm, I don't really. Um, I don't think I think Western education, number one, is a structure. Um, it's also it's also organized, but it's also relatively new for Indigenous people. Um, speaking, as a Nez Perce, I am an enrolled member of the Nez Perce tribe, and we're, looking at um, just a couple of hundred years of real documented historical, um, I guess, I I think the way I see it is it's, 200 years is new. And we have cultural knowledge that predates that. And so Western systems provide a structure for a certain type of system, your public schools, your higher education, your administrations, your infrastructure, all of that, the systemic, um, organized structure. And archaeology of knowledge begins from a settler colonial space when we privilege the Western construct before the ancestral indigenous knowledge. And I don't always think that it's good for us. However, it does provide structure. It does help us to um, move and also create and build and survive, but more importantly, to adapt to this world. You do find, at least I do, I find and see pockets and spaces where education has not, um, I guess, permeated into it yet. And there's some good to that. And you can find that in young children, right? Little babies. They're so pure. They haven't been um, they haven't been taught and repetitively told that this is your world, this is your knowledge, this is your history, this is your construct of what it means to be a Nez Perce. Or on the flip side, and balancing that, I'm also Dene. In Dene culture, there are very clear distinctions of what is non-native and what is. And the cultural natives pieces, they're not for the public. Even though you have people posting on TikTok, Instagram, on social medias, whatever, there's still a realm that is untouchable because that's what our teachings are told. They're just something you just won't see because that's how they're taught. It's how we're told you can't do this. And the same within the Pacific Northwest. And so when I think about Western education, I've used it. I've gone all the way to the top. I got my PhD. And really, as my mentor told me, and also my faculty chair, they basically, my chair was she was Black and Japanese. Japanese, actually, her mom raised her. She was Japanese, and her father was Black. She now works at a historical Black university back east, and I'm privileged. And she shared, getting a doctorate is a privilege. It is not something everybody can go through and well accomplish in a short time. It's something that takes time, and when you accomplish that, you have a responsibility, an obligation to turn around and teach and help people. And I think that's what it is for me. It's not something I think as a tool to, in so many ways, it is to help the people, but in a different capacity, not so much in a Western sense, but using it from an Indigenous sense. So I'm very much about the principles, um, how I was taught. And I didn't always think this way. Just make sure you add that in there. Because I didn't always think this way or believe this way because I went through my youth believing I knew everything, right? Like I didn't need my parents' instruction. I could do whatever I wanted, and you know, they're in their right to say and do that as every parent is, but they also were like, she'll be back, you know. And I think that's the beauty of being a parent is you understand, when your child is growing up that you might have to let them go, and they'll come back and they'll circle back the way we all do. We all come around full circle and realize that maybe our moms did know a little something. Maybe our, grandma really did know what the heck was going on. She just didn't know how to articulate it, or she had a certain kind of tone of voice that I didn't like. You know, those are things that I realize now because I have children of my own. And my oldest just turned 30. And so we're having conversation on her birthday, and she mentioned that, I'm not a kid no more, mom. Like, I'm really legit a grown adult. And I was like, you are. And it's hard for me because I still see my kids as these little little people that I was trying to herd around. And they're like, we make our own decisions, we do what we want, and they let me think that we're gonna do this or that, and at the end they're like, okay, we're gonna go do this, we're doing something else. That kind of, education, it's hard. And so I don't always think of Western education the same way like I used to. I don't rely on it as much as I used to think that it was the key or the tool. I think it's a mechanism. I think it's a place. I think it's something that we can use because a lot of good things have come from it. A lot of healing knowledge is out there, but juxtapose that with Indigenous knowledge. And equally so, there's the same amount of healing knowledge, cultural knowledge, um, and science. There's a lot of that. We just didn't know that that's what it was because Western systems told us this is knowledge. This is, you know, how your history evolved. And for the longest time, I was part of that. I used to proudly, not know and sing these songs without really knowing their history. You know, God bless America, America the Great. Like I used to sing all these, believe it or not, they're hymnals. Um, and I see the world so differently now that I don't always sing them, but I can hum them and hear when I hear them, I'm like, "Oh, I know that song." But when you know the history of your people, which really isn't the history that you've been taught, you start to think and reconsider what you believed was history or was knowledge. And I think that's that intellectual process, that nation idea or notion of nation, it changes. And I think that's where I'm at. I used to want to indigenize the academy, and putting, indigenous knowledge into the academy, and my program's going to be this and this is going to be that, and we're going to work on this. And we, you know it just it didn't turn out the way that I thought. There was good things that came of it, um, but we cannot really look at uh, our ancestors and tell them, I I decolonized by putting your cultural teachings into the academy. I I don't think that's it. It just sounds funny to say that, like to tell my ancestor, "Oh, but I taught these kids, mostly non-native kids at the university or the school, our knowledge." When I realized some of that was happening, I was like, "Wait a minute." And my world started colliding. My struggles started to begin to look like, "Wait a minute, you know, this is for native people. This is for native students." And so I then, created a project that was just native students. And it was a world of difference. There was still struggle. However, we approached it from land-based education, community-based cultural knowledge. Um, and then we also looked at, what were some of the conflicting spaces, and that that was kind of where, we really looked at, what does it mean to be an Indian person in the academy, and that's kind of where my trajectory changed. And it's been 10 years, since I graduated. I accomplished my degree, and I stopped, during COVID. There was a rude interruption of all of that, so I didn't really get to go through what I traditional would have been on in a traditional path. And so serving in a postdoc position for the last couple of years, I really had to reconsider my positionality. And it's not what it used to be 10 years ago, that's for sure. And it's most definitely the most land-based it's ever been. And it's not, yeah, it did not come so easily. It was a process. It didn't just
That's
happen.
what the process of what has really just got my mind, open to uh, just being ready to embrace that the spiritual journey of the process will evolve your beliefs in things. I mean, I used to think of and even just in the context of this conversation before we started it, of land-based education as a form of resistance. And then when you were speaking earlier, I thought, well, hell, I did that too. Education was a form of resistance in some regard. Like, nobody in my family graduated from high school, so I'm going to graduate from high school. And then it was like, my sister graduated from high school. It was like, the next, what is that next? Being the first in my family to college and graduate from college. But it was there that I realized, there's certain aspects of the education journey where you could become a part of the problem.
Mm.
And so education is resistance, that changes and evolves so much, even during that journey. And um, I appreciate you sharing the COVID component, because my son was graduating from high same time, and I was trying to embrace all of those mom moments of getting the senior pictures and getting the invites out and celebrating and recognizing that transition, and it didn't happen, and things were just so different. And then I realized our young people everywhere were coping in different ways. And you as a scholar during that time, finding ways to figure out how you heal through such an unprecedented and unknown time, like that.
Mm.
Disruption of life, family, education. So I'm just curious, as you talk about your doctoral candidacy experience, how how were you able to do a lot of that as a mom? Because I know from just knowing you as a sister and knowing your journey that you had young people in school during that same time that you were going to school. Can you talk a little bit about what that matriarchal self-care looks like when a majority of what you have is always.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. And I think that's a big piece of my life's work up to this point in really grasping with what I want to contribute to the world. And that is, from a matriarchal perspective, I'm a young matriarch. My mom's 75, she'll be 76 this year. She's got an older sister who's 89. I have an auntie who's 93, 90. Like I have my elder aunties, and I still have elders in my on my Navajo Diné side. And have never claimed or ever said I'm an elder. I think that is egregious when somebody claims it, like forces it onto me. And when I see federal guidelines stipulate, you must meet federal age guidelines, 55 is senior, that kind of freaks me out because I'm like, yo, I'm like getting close to that age and I am by far, you know, elder or matriarch for sure. I'm a young matriarch. I'm a mother, and my mother's still here, and my mother's oldest sibling is still here, who is the matriarch in our family, and she's still coherent. Um, they still have stories, they still have knowledge, and so when I meet other families, that also have the same similarities, I appreciate that because um on this other juxtaposed to this side, my Nimipu side, we're a young family. And I I don't have an elder here. I've got elders regionally, and I look to them. And so one thing that I've learned, to fortify for myself, and this is being a mom, is there are times where I just had to say no, and I stayed home. Home was my space, my safe space, but my children have a very clear, vivid memory of us being home all the time. And some people might find that, um, one of my sons was like, "Yeah, mom, I have a different type of trauma." And I was like, "What? You have trauma, of course, no parent wants to feel or think they've done anything." But he was like, I remember when you were so tired that you would just come straight home, cook dinner, would eat, and then you would sit there and fall asleep on a movie because that was our thing, was to watch a movie after school, after work, whatever, relax. And he said, and I'd always look over and you'd be asleep, and it'd be like 8:30, and we'd have to go to bed because you were asleep. And there are times where he'd wake me up and tell me to go to my room, and I did that. That's how I managed. I didn't survive without managing something. But that survival was not sustainable. Um, I burnt out. In fact, I even went to the ER. I was having a heart attack, and come to find out that I had an ulcer. And um I look back to that time and I was like averaging 4 hours of sleep. So I'd wake up middle of the night and I'd get up and then I'd go and I'd write. And I had to work the next morning, so I'd get my kids up. I was up by 4. always up and doing something, and by 6, my kids would be up. And so that was not healthy. Obviously, my body was resisting, like, hello. And so I barely managed. I had to take that semester off. Um, Talking with my professor, and I went to school, and it felt so good to take that semester off. And then a year later, I had to take another semester off for the same thing. And it really does sound silly, but I was prescribed sleep when I saw my diagnosis. And diagnosis was graduate student syndrome. And 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 it said sleep. And he prescribed sleep aid, anti-anxiety meds. But I could not believe it, but that, that time away, that when I look back on that time, that was one of the most challenging things. But it wasn't until I went home that summer and one of my aunties, my Bija means paternal aunt. She was like, you gotta take care of yourself. If you can't take care of yourself, you're not able to take care of your kids. And if you need to take a break, just tell people I need to take a break. And it's okay, if you can't do it. And I've never forgotten that. And those are some of her last push to the finish. And my mom came to live with us for the last 6 months. And I needed that. I truly needed that. And my mom was the one who would push me, and she would, in Navajo, we have this expression called yego, yego, and just keep pushing, keep doing it. You can do it. Yego is almost like, come on, you can do it. And so my mom would tell me that. My mom would feed that to me, and she would come and help. And I attribute that. I couldn't have done that without my mom or my auntie's words and wisdoms, or my other sisters who went through their PhD programs. It really does help to have others who've gone through it because they've been through something similar. But I didn't get through that alone. Um, I went through a lot, and my professor was pretty patient, but she was also very strict. Like, we need to get you done. I went 6.5 years, and actually, yeah, 6.5 years, because I graduated in December. But I had colleagues who were done in 5 years. They didn't have kids, they didn't have families. And it's possible, but when you have children, your children need their mom. There's basketball games, there were soccer games, football games. There's so much that I remember from my youngest that I had to do even when I was tired. And I think people think that, you know, matriarchy is just motherhood, but it's many other things as well. It's also maintaining your home, providing safety, being able to provide financially, resourceful. There's things in matriarchy, and it's not always an oldest child. It's not the namesake. It comes out in different ways, but I learned, when you have elder women in your life, there is matriarchy. And coming from Diné society, the world over knows that we're matriarchal. And they're just expectations. They're just certain things that are unspoken. And one of them was you just keep going. And my mom speaking life into me while she was living with us for those last 6 months was very much needed. And I think that's what helped me. I couldn't
I
have
think of
done it.
that. Yes. Despite how tired, how stretched thin, worked, still just showing up, always, in your amazing matriarchal energy, just showing up. And you mentioned earlier, and I think about how people think of just, I'm just surviving. And it seems like such a passive act, but even the act of survival is act. It is a responsibility and a duty to just keep showing up and doing the thing. But we don't see that from everywhere. That drive doesn't seem as intrinsic. I mean, I feel kind of, I don't know, I think of that even myself in our work that we do in community. What is it that drives somebody, to give them that tenacity to want to serve, to, be present, to do more, um, making that conscious choice to not, drink, drug, do all of those other things, and to just, be committed. And I always think it just comes back to that, you know, duty and responsibility to our ancestors. But more importantly, the present day impact that the matriarchs around us had. Like my grandma, she was a boarding school survivor. She's tells the stories about what it was like to be, riding in the back roads, drinking and leaving her kids at home, and about what that did to her Tamina, and it was always those stories, lessons. And I know she told me this because, even if there was even sometimes shame in talking about these things, it was because I don't ever want you to think that those are options for you. And that's this role that now I play or you play, in speaking directly to Indigenous youth, future educators, the community space that are around us, especially the work that we do now in uh, our sons, graduating together from the same local high school that still has a lot of, questionable integrity about their recognition and authentic recognition of our people's place in this landscape and dedication towards that paradigm of place-based education. What are what are some of those things that you would, if you could have a wish list kind of things, what are some of those things that you would want other young Indigenous matriarchs to reflect upon as they're getting ready to go on their education journey? And I'm thinking more like post-secondary education. I say that because when I think of K-12 education, uh, very very little room for intellectual freedom. Not saying that there is an expansive amount of that in an undergrad experience either, necessarily, because sometimes you're not thinking in those directions. But in the context of our young men getting transition into a next phase in their life, if they were saying, Auntie Renee, I'm thinking about going to Lewis Clark State College, what's some advice that you need before I go to school?
Mm, let's see. Well, first I would say, congrats. You made it through. The first rung of Western education is your K through 12. It's unfortunate that we, you know, don't have other systems. And second, I believe in science. I think you should major in science. I think you should focus in some area of science, whether it's land, geology, natural resources, fisheries, water resources, but get into land. You know, you want to do plumbing, learn how to read the land, know the temperature, understand water. Why? Because you're native. You have that inherently written into your DNA. It's in your blood. Literally, it's in your DNA. And your genetic makeup as a scientist is older than this country. Don't ever forget that. You are a natural born scientist. We Indigenous people are natural born scientists. I currently work with the Indigenous Resilience Center, and we work in Native-FEWSS. My supervisor, faculty mentor, she's a hydrologist, working, with people internationally. And there's a universal um, occurrence. And I saw it when I was in school. So 10 years ago, I saw this, and this is what I believed, and I'm doing what I saw then, right? Like in working in resiliency, um, climate sustainability, environmentalism. I somebody once called me a conservationist, and I'm like, that's a cheesy soyapa word. Don't call me that. I'm indigenous. I'm native. Of course, I'm going to do this. I grew up doing this, but so did we. All of us have. If you go hunting, if you go fishing, if you go gathering, you're a natural born scientist. You know how to read the land. That's your first, that's your first responsibility. So when you go to these schools, make sure you read those books and make sure you do understand. And if you don't, then let somebody know you want to understand, because you have to get yourself out there on the land at one point or another, but you also have to get involved with the people. And the movement making that we live and that we know of doesn't always mean you have to read the books. um and there's ways to learn things that you already know, but it also doesn't mean don't seek out people to learn from. Find a mentor. Get a mentor. A mentor is somebody who's 10 years older than you. Get involved, get invested, and learn that you're now a student of the world, not just college. And when you get on this next leg of your journey for the next 10 years as a young person, up to the age of 30, your job is to learn as much as you can. Yeah, you'll make mistakes, but make the good choices and understand and know that your responsibility to the land is ancestral, goes older than this country, than this state. And the system isn't going to tell you that. System wants you to fit in. And, indigenous people don't always fit in those nice little tidy boxes. Um, and the core of who we are as indigenous people is related to our families, our communities, and our nation and the lands that we come from. And so, our knowledge is ancient. It's as old as the land. It's as old as these hills that we live among. And so I think, really sharing with them that it's so important to learn science. Focus on science, get a science degree. I got a bachelor's in science and I had to take biology. Um, and I look back on that and I wished I would have stuck to it. I wished I would have. I didn't. I got involved with, I ended up going into social science because I thought I was going to go into law. Um, so I got a history degree. But, I look back on it now and just think, if I could do it over, the land is our teacher. The land is our grandmother, Nihima, Nihimabaka. And Navajo philosophy on life is based on Hojo. It's a concept of inner wellness, inner being, inner knowing, that when you know yourself, you respect others, you'll want to do the same with others. And when you get that out of balance, you can find yourself angry, you can find yourself defensive, aggressive, anxious, restless. There's all these negatives, depressed. That is an imbalance. When you're depressed, when you have anxiety, when you have all of this, it means you're imbalanced. And so when you seek your inner balance, you learn that not everybody's out there to hurt you, that not everybody out there wants to fight, that not everybody is in contention with you, that sometimes you're in contention with yourself. And learning another language, learning another way of being, outside of learning your own cultural language is really a start. And I think just remembering, that the Western systems of education can be used for good. And science is one of the ways that, can help many people. I strongly believe in science. I want
Mhm.
all kids to become science majors, even my own kids. I would love for them to become scientists. My youngest always wanted to be a geologist, and I hope he still does do that. I don't know if he will, but he loves science.
Ah,
And I think that's, land right there. That's
yep.
intelligence that's picking up soil and reading the water. That's knowledge. And I think that following a colonial system and staying on that path can take you away from your culture, as it did for me. It took me away from mine. It healed me in some sense. I learned, healing practices, but they were all Western. And it wasn't until I went through the cultural healing that I really understood what I just went through. The colonizers' education systems are much different than our indigenous. We value different things. We also look at things collectively, not individually. And we don't base things on, we have a different merit system. It's not merit as in you got all A's. It's a different type of meritocracy where it's your character when nobody's looking, when the creator is the only one watching you. It's how you speak about yourself to others or how you speak about others. Like there's so many different ways that education comes in, and it's all principle based. It's your character, it's your language, it's your cultural knowledge, it's your ceremonial practices, it's your reciprocity, your generosity, it's your kindness, your compassion to people that are not kind or compassionate towards you. Like there's a lot of layers to it, but it's the best, you know, closest thing to being a principled human being. And I think Diné culture helps maintain that for me. That sustains me. And that's why I believe in it. And I think that's the part of matriarchy that I'm very much that is my identity. And I have Nez Perce influence and Nez Perce cultural comprehension to some extent, but I'm deeply rooted in the matriarchy. And so my mother's mother and her mother's mother and her mother before her, we have stories. And the motherhood, the first mother, it's a beautiful story of emergence. And it goes so far back, that we can see, where there was where there was Western um, influence, intermarriage, right? I had a grandmother who had blue eyes, and but she did not speak English, and my grandmother spoke Spanish, but they didn't see themselves as that, but they spoke it. And then we have family who are Spanish, Mexican clan, and we have so much Spanish language in our family. Like it's really interesting. But the best way I could share, there's a Diné poet out there who I just absolutely adore his work. And in one of, he did a lecture at an Ivy League years ago. And he reminded us, and he spoke in Diné, but he reminded us to learn as many languages as you can because our ancestors were, you know, trilingual people. They not only spoke Diné, they had to learn Spanish, English, and German and other tribal languages because that was the that was the commerce. They spoke the language of the commerce. And and so my resistance or my refusal, is also my liberation. And that is to be able to practice my culture, speak my language, talk to my kids in our language. My older kid is more familiar and versed in Nimi Putimpt because her paternal grandmother was such an influence in her life. And I'm proud of that. I'm happy for her in that. And then my youngest has more of Denebizod, and then my middle child, he balances both. And but he prefers Spanish. And I want that for each of them. You know, they each have their own their own individual, and then they're all, in their own identifying ways. They look at things, from a different generation, but to truly look at education systems, I don't really see things the same way. I don't look at myself as an educator as I did before. I see myself as a scientist now, because I love to look at the land. I love to read the land. I look to see, how much water is around. Is there snow? What are the berries going to look like? I know when the berries came out this year, but they didn't come out like that last year. I'm more attuned with that than I've ever been before. And it's really because, I had to make some of my own, I had to make some amendments with myself. What is more important, and so balancing being Dene and also, having Nimipu influence, I've had to learn to balance the two. But definitely looking at Western education from a much different perspective than I did 10 years ago, and also looking at culture and community, looking at how, healing happens. There's Western systems of healing, but there's also indigenous cultural healing. And I believe both were needed to help me to get to this place. But if we can do some prevention with children, I believe that we ought to do the cultural first and introduce that first. And then eventually we can weave in some of the Western concepts, but indigenous cultural knowledge, that's the key. Like that's the mechanism that I believe in. What if there was a resurgence, a cultural resurgence, it's to begin and doing immersion of indigenous cultural knowledge in all aspects of our society. That that's kind of how I see it.
I love them. Thank you so much for getting so intimate in your response and sharing, because that's so spot on. Like science integrated in, it is land-based education, and that takes it outside of the context of just being intellectual. It allows it to be sensory, to be emotional, even spiritual, which is important for us in understanding and addressing the unfinished grief component. But I love what you just said, and that other specific note, because um education can be very healing. I know I had a lot of healing through my education process, but there was a hell of a lot of unlearning going on during that whole entire process. And so flipping that around to where, like, what we had a little bit more on the front end, or a lot more on the front end of the base knowledge and foundation of us, and then we go on that education journey of beyond our community, and then it's learning, it's not unlearning as much with those lies our
Yeah.
teachers told us, that in that wonderful pre-K experience, because it shouldn't
Mm.
be traumatic. It shouldn't be as traumatic as it still continues to be. Possibly could even get even more as we move forward. But if we got into the political construct of education in the current framework, a whole nother show. So maybe we'll have to think about that and rebook you for another show. But again, because land-based education, integration of indigenous ways of knowing as science-based education, allows us to not just have it so binary. I appreciate you sharing that. So as we kind of look at wrapping up our conversation, and we talk about that whole process of balance and healing and unlearning, can you tell us just a little bit about what you are looking forward to unlearning in 2026?
Ooh, fear and self-loathing. I want to unlearn. On the real though, I think, there's some real legit aspects to unlearning fear. And I received a book. I was gifted a book a couple years ago, and I haven't read it. And I came across it, and it's a book about the book is it's about having fear guide and protect you, and how there's good to it, and not to be fearless to the extent of ignorance or naive ignorance, but really to unlearn, the Western, I guess, knowledge of what a woman is supposed to be, that she's supposed to be in this subservient manner and not supposed to speak up and not supposed to do this and not to do that. And I think about my mother, my aunties, the mothers in my life. I have many moms. So one of the things in Diné culture, Diné society, um, is, in matriarchy, you can be born a grandmother. Like literally your first day of birth, you're called Shemai, my little auntie or my grandmother. And that stays with you your entire life. And so um, I understand that now, but when I was younger, I didn't. And I think that's such a beautiful way to exist and be in this world, because there was a time that I didn't. I was embarrassed by that. I didn't want to, I just thought it was silly. But now I love that. I love that practice because it places me in a role, and then it also identifies me in my role. And so the fear to not speak up is a Western teaching. A woman is only to be seen and not heard. That is not true in Native society. I hope you guys will know that. You men, particularly, when you hear this, just understand and know that in Native society, that's not accurate. That's a that's a misunderstanding or misrepresentation, because especially in a matriarchal societies have a whole different understanding of the world, and the concept of warrior comes from women. And just war itself was not waged until the women spoke. Those are things that people don't always talk about, and they think, women are just subservient, and somewhere these non-native women think that being a subservient woman to an Indian man or an Indian woman with a white man, like all of this, there was fear about speaking up on that, you know? And I think Franz Fanon did a wonderful job, so I want to read more of him, and I want to integrate his work more. There's a couple of other scholars that I want to resource and write from. He's one of the first because he challenged me to think differently. Um, and then also, I just want to honor the women that have come before me who were doing the work too. I saw this metaphor recently that if you're walking on a path and your path is clear, it means somebody walked before you. And so, always knowing that someone walked before me, um, it's definitely appreciated. But there's fear also when I see that there is no path, because I'm thinking, where do I go? How do I get through this? There's nobody to show me, there's no one to teach me. And fear will have me turn around and just go home and be like, okay. But to not have that fear means, okay, I've got to make a way, because I've got children, I've got my nieces, my nephews, my grandbabies, I got family, women, um, who are thinking, I think I want to go to school and get my PhD. And I'm always like, make sure you find a school that has funding for you. Do not go into debt, because there are schools that have funding. And so I really want to make sure that that's something. And then I think, I joke about self-loathing, but That's some real stuff for me too. As a writer, I really want to put myself out there more this year. So I really thank you for this opportunity, especially with Women's History Month. I just have some goals, some personal goals to meet, not only for myself, but for my children. And really, yeah, just living life and understanding and knowing that I have a responsibility, also to my sisters and to my mom, my aunties. Both my grandmothers are no longer here, but I have aunties who are like my grandmothers. And so, they're old enough, 89 and 91. I've got grandmother elders. And if I can be half the women that they were, at my age, they're in their elderly age now, but when they turned 50, these women were fire, you know, they were awesome. And I see it, I hear stories, and I'm like, if I can do just one thing, while I'm at this place at this time, and that's kind of what I feel like with my writing. I'm at that space now, and I just, yeah, just thankful, really appreciate it, and I hope that people will see, the strength and the beauty and the resilience and also the survivance in matriarchy, and how the protection of women and children is so very needed in this Western, this construct of a world that's crumbling. It's been run into the ground because we've listened to patriarchy for so long. And it's just time for our women to lead, our young girls, and to show that our young girls can lead, and to let the women teach the girls, not the men. That's not matriarchy. I just hope you all understand that. Like, that's a big thing. And it might be gendered, and people might think, oh no, that's being gender biased. No, women raise children differently than men. They really do. There's a more um, cultural awareness that it's just, it's in our DNA. It's in our DNA to nurture children differently. And men, ancestral men knew that. And they didn't challenge it. They actually were like, that's the women's role. I'd like to see some of that come back, and to challenge our men to think about it in a good way and to not be defensive. And I got to give shout outs to one of my brothers out there in the movement and his wife, Dosh, and his wife, Chelsea. Like, I watched them from when they were young, like 10 years ago, even before then. And he has such an awesome space for what healthy Indigenous masculinity is. And I think that's a part of matriarchy that we don't always talk about is matriarchs do uphold and respect that role of masculinity. And I think being fearless in representing healthy men comes from other healthy men. And I think women who support that is really big. But I just want to give them shout outs because they do a really good job. But within, Native women and just women in general, whether you're Native or not, Women's History Month is an awesome time to celebrate. And some of the most healthy Indigenous men out there celebrate women in the most respectful way.
Oh, Dr. Renee Holt, one of my favorite matriarchs. Thank you so much for getting dirty with us today, for reminding us that the land just simply isn't just a backdrop. She's our relative, and the education isn't neutral, and that matriarchy is a practice. It's a living practice. And to all of our listeners out there, this conversation definitely doesn't end here. Take it to the land, take the science to your classroom, take it to your kitchen tables. This is Her Many Voices. This is Gaia Gossip. Thank you. Until next time.
Thank you again for joining us at Her Many Voices Gaia Gossip. Remember, whatever you do for another, you do for yourself. For more information, head over to hermanyvoices.org to learn more about other programs and get involved. From all of us at Gaia Gossip and Her Many Voices Foundation, thank you, and until next time.